Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Orbit Live event. I'm excited to have Craig DiLouie and Kira Jane Buxton here tonight. Kira is visiting us from Grand Central Publishing. She is the author of Hollow Kingdom, a post-apocalyptic novel about a foul-mouthed crow. Craig DiLouie is the author of several novels of horror and dark fantasy, including the upcoming The Children of Red Peak, a cult-based horror novel which will come out from Red Hook in November. Throughout this event, Craig and Kira will be answering your questions. I see a few of you have already entered questions using the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen. Keep them coming. You can also vote on your fellow attendees' questions so that the most popular questions get answered first. This event will be recorded and a replay will be available after it's over. If you aren't able to stay for the full event, you can watch the replay, and you can also share it with your friends or followers using the same link that you used to enter the event today. Follow Orbit Live on Crowdcast to be notified about upcoming events with more great authors. Next week, we have legendary fantasy authors Brent Weeks and Joe Abercrombie, which should be a fun event. And now I'm very happy to turn things over to Craig and Kira. Take it away.
Hey, it's great to be here with you, Kira. And thank you, everyone, for coming.
And thank you for joining us in our homes. It's so intimate now.
Well, we couldn't be happier to see. We already have a lot of questions, and I know this event's very well attended, and so we couldn't be happier to be able to talk to you about our fiction. Obviously, our work's very important to us, and it's so wonderful to hear that it's important to you too, as our readers. And so, speaking of being a reader, Kira, I'm going to start things off asking you a question. I'm already turning into a fan. I became aware of your work through this event and hadn't read Hollow Kingdom yet, but after I finished Paul Tremblay's Survivor Song, which was a good book, I started reading yours, and I'm a couple chapters into it. I'm very, very curious about what's going to happen next, and I have to say I'm hooked. After I told you before this started, I've used to write zombie fiction. I've read a lot of zombie fiction, so I'm very jaded about it. So I love hearing a new voice, and especially kind of a different take on a bit of a literary take. So I know a lot of the people here are fans of yours, and they're familiar with the book. But for anybody else on the call who should be reading you, wanted to ask you to introduce Hollow Kingdom. Tell us about it, and what inspired you to write it.
Absolutely. Well, firstly, thank you. It's absolute pleasure to be here with you. I'm mildly intimidated because you're so prolific and you've written so many wonderful books in different genres, and specifically zombie fiction. You have a whole, amazing sort of repertoire. So I'm the newbie. Hollow Kingdom. I'll point to it there. My little bright green book. It's my debut. It's really hard to describe. And I know people who've read it also have a really hard time describing it. I've been describing it as a humorous literary dystopian novel with some horror elements and some fantasy and some nature writing, which is very bizarre and difficult. I feel bad for booksellers and librarians that have to categorize it too. And they do an amazing job with that. But yeah, it's basically, it's the story of ST, and I don't know if I'm allowed to say what that's short for. It's very rude, his name. ST is this domesticated crow who has been raised by Big Jim in the Ravenna neighborhood of Seattle. So he's this crow that has really become very human in his thinking. He loves everything that we do. He watches TV, and he has this kind of crass, rude, good old boy owner. So his whole sort of life view is filtered through this character. So he has a kind of very funny bird's eye view of what humanity is. He loves Cheetos, the finest food of mankind, and he's got a specific shows he likes to watch, and he knows a lot about the natural world from like National Geographic and the Discovery Channel, but he doesn't really want anything to do with it. He doesn't consider himself a crow, and bah humbug to all the natural world. Much rather have human man-made things. So one day something happens to Big Jim. His eyeball falls out, rather unfortunately. and ST thinks, ooh, that seems a little off. So he tries to do everything he can to fix him, and he realizes that the problem's a little bit more widespread and that other humans have been afflicted by whatever this is. So he has to sort of venture out of the comfort of his little Ravenna nest and go out into the natural world with his bloodhound sidekick, who is owned by Big Jim as well. And it is the story of the adventures that happen there. And it's funny, it's dystopian, it's got a lot of elements to it, but really what it is at its core is it's an environmental parable. It's my love letter to the natural world. Yeah.
Yeah, I found, I thought it was funny, but I also thought it was very bittersweet. Those left behind in the natural world and in the zombie apocalypse look at us with love or as mystery, like we were strange creatures. What thematically, where were you going with this?
Well, at the time and continually, I worry about climate change. And so I was investigating sort of how I could tell a tale that was an environmental parable, that didn't have sort of that very didactic, heavy-handed message, that wasn't too depressing. I wanted to see if I could sort of bring this conflation of things that I really am interested in. I've always been interested in animals, and I have befriended 2 wild crows. I spend time with them every day, so I have a real, understanding of their behavior, and I have a good camaraderie with them and a lot of the other birds around me. And I wanted to find ways to embrace this idea that we have this amazing connection to the natural world. We're a part of it. We're not sort of its sovereign. We have this in a lot of our fiction and a lot of the way we live our lives. There's this sort of very anthropocentric view that we are, the sovereigns of this world. We are the dominant species. And I'm more interested in exploring, viewpoints from other characters, and also sort of shining a light on some of these issues that, that these animals are worth protecting, Right. The biodiversity is like the best part of our planet. Yeah.
And you can satirize the silliness of human society and our self-importance by putting it through the lens of the animals. Yeah.
A bird's eye view. Yes, absolutely. I think that's the beauty of satire too. It's sort of a sugar-coated, way to sort of, I don't want to say, I suppose, punch up or to address, inadequacies or, problems with society, which is, I think, a lot of apocalyptic fiction addresses that.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. How about you tell me about The Children of Red Peak, which is your new novel, which comes out November 17th?
Yes. And this is not funny. It's straight up horror. This is a book that might make people cry. The novel is about a group of people. They grew up in a new religious movement that was in an isolated community. This community eventually morphed into what we would consider a cult, a dangerous cult. And under that influence, there was the horrific ending to this. They're among the sole survivors. And now we see them as adults, and it's many years later, and they're still coping with the trauma of what they experienced. So when a fellow survivor commits suicide, the few remaining reunite after many, many years to confront their past and the entity that appeared on the final night. And so that's the basic plot of the book. It's told in 2 storylines. So in the present, we see the characters kind of see how they're coping, how they've adapted to the trauma that they experienced, and the threads that will pull them back together and then take them back to Red Peak to confront their past directly, physically. And then the other storyline is the past, where we see these characters as children growing up in this commune, and what that was like, and how I think it will challenge some of our notions of what a cult is, and also sows. The past storyline also presents the mystery. It's where all the mysteries of the past are revealed, because memory is a faulty thing. And so what we're seeing in the present is people struggling to remember, and then slowly they do remember. And as they do, these past events are revealed in these flashbacks. And so that's basically the story in a nutshell, I'd say.
Yes, I'm reading it and I'm loving it. And I wonder, in terms of, I feel like I've just got one toe in the horror genre. I don't think I qualify as a horror writer, but I want to ask you, as somebody who has to read horror in the daytime because I'm a scaredy cat, how did you come to write horror?
Well, I started in science fiction and fantasy, ended up going into horror by way of zombies. And so I was a struggling small press writer and writing sci-fi and fantasy and psychological thrillers, and then wrote a zombie book kind of at the right place at the right time. Back then, there were only maybe 30 or 40 of us who had books out. And this book just, like I said, it was just pure luck, which is, success in publishing is hard work, being prolific, and get lucky. Have something that just connects with people. And of course, keep learning, right? Always try and be a better writer than you were last year, recognizing you're not as good a writer as you'll be next year. And so I wrote this book.
I should be taking notes. This is very good. This is very good advice. Yes.
I know you know this already though. And you strike me as the kind of person who's a learner, because your debut is highly polished and shows it. So this book came out at the right place at the right time. Ended up writing a couple more zombie books, and I was fascinated with the apocalypse. I've always loved apocalyptic fiction. I grew up on disaster movies of the 70s, and just love that idea. What if the Poseidon Adventure was on the global scale? Woo, blow your mind. And I love the idea of that. It was the same thing that pulled me to sci-fi. And fantasy was the same thing that pulled me to apocalyptic, and the same thing that pulled me to horror. This idea that we can really learn a lot about the human condition through contrast with the fantastic. So if you have a speculative element and you tell a story about people with a speculative element instead of the other way around, you can tell a very powerful story that's highly revealing about the characters and about human nature in general. You really find out about something when they're tested by crisis. And I also found that I tend to write stories about people undergoing trauma. It's for personal reasons. And one of the things that I really started kicking it on apocalyptic fiction is, I was in New York on 9/11, and the woman I was married to at the time was on the 82nd floor of the North Tower. The plane hit five floors under her head, and for a couple hours I thought she was gone. And she showed up covered in dust. The building collapsed around her, and she made it out. But it took me so long. I mean, she needed to do the real processing because she was there, but I had to do my own processing, just dealing with this whole horrific possible potential loss. And so a lot of my fiction is, I find myself gravitating back to that a lot. Stories where people are dealing with something that's happening to them now or happened as a past event, and they're dealing with it as just processing the trauma, and how does trauma shape human development, human behavior, and how do we address it, which ended up bringing me to Children of Red Peak. So I'm writing about a cult, not only when it's happening, but as a past event where you have people living with the trauma of it. And I was inspired from this. I was familiar with I wanted to write about it, but what really got me interested in the form was Kin by Keelan Patrick Burke. So here's a guy who writes a novel about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, basically, which is this iconic slasher horror movie. But he's like, what about the final girl who got away? How did she deal with this? What she went through? It was so horrific. How did she deal with that? And so his whole novel, Kin, is about what happens after the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And I was like, wow, that's so beautiful. I love that. And I love that idea of doing something like that. So and I'm attracted to movies like the Robin Williams Hook, Peter Pan, right? What happens after he grows up? Yeah. I always like what happens after Prince Charming kills the dragon. Does he have PTSD? Does he scream in his sleep? Does he have PTSD? That was a horrific fight,
he did.
What's the princess dealing with? How is she dealing being a prisoner of the dragon? And so I'm always attracted to that kind of thing. And that's what ended up kind of fueling psychologically and emotionally the content behind Red Peak.
fascinating. That's fascinating. Yeah, they would.
I warned you I was
these
wordy,
stories.
so sorry, everybody.
No, it's fantastic.
Long
It's
answer, short
fascinating.
question.
Absolutely fascinating. Yeah. And then specifically, we have this real, I mean, I certainly have had a fascination with cults. I think this idea of like, maybe it's a similar thing to when we watch the zombie genre, there tends to be a kind of, this focus on a core group of people who have survived,
Right.
against all odds, or, the unlikely survivors. And there's something very seductive about that, as a reader or viewer, that you could imagine yourself in that role, as the survivor.
Yeah.
And I feel like it's a similar element with thinking about cults. I think I remember watching Wild Wild Country about the Bhagwan, and I realized I was anticipating each episode, and I thought, what are you hunting for? What are you looking for? And I was looking for the ways that people were indoctrinated, and wondering if I would, because I know I wouldn't survive the zombie. I'd be one of the first to go in a zombie apocalypse. I'd chase after some animal, or I'm blonde. I'd be gone. But maybe the cult thing, maybe I would be able to resist, or what are those things? What was your experience with research for, cults?
Oh, sure. Well, first off, if there was a zombie apocalypse, I would be brushing up on my yoga so I could be flexible enough to kiss my own ass goodbye, because I would not survive it either. So that would be what I would do. Okay, so
Great.
But I love the apocalyptic genre for that. I find there are two types of readers. There's the wish fulfillment reader, what I call the Z Nation crowd, and then this is existential fear reader, where it's the Walking Dead crowd, right? So the Z Nation is probably a larger group, and they look at the apocalypse as wish fulfillment. They want to be the last person standing, and they don't want to pay taxes and have a job. They just want to they're surviving, right? And they don't think about things like, oh, what happens when you need a dentist? And then that's it. The other type of readers, more like me, where I started writing and reading this stuff more in my 40s, and my daughter had just been born, and I started to have all these existential fears, and they came bursting out in my fiction, apocalyptic fiction, where I was looking at oh my God, I really have something now. What if I lost it all? What would that be like? And so I really got to exercise those demons. For the writing this novel about cults, I found that it was very interesting, just in terms of belief. It was inspired by a reading of a passage of the Bible of Abraham and Isaac, and Abraham is told by God to sacrifice his son, and Abraham salutes and says, "You're God, I'm going to do this." And then at the last moment, when the knife's coming down, God says, "Don't do that." But what if God didn't? And so just that question is sort of a philosophical mind blower, and philosophically destructive to the psyche, right? And so I was interested in that idea, where is that line between belief and delusion, or where a belief becomes harmful? And that's really what cults are all about. We have this idea that cults are crazy from the get-go, but really what they are is there are thousands of new religious movements, and many of the religions that are considered conventional today started as new religious movements, as heresies of their own. And so a lot of these groups are out there, and there's nothing wrong with this, but where they become cults is in their degree of harm. And so if they are using techniques like thought control, and their corporal punishment, and they're hurting their members and trying to control them and manipulate them, then it starts to become what we would call a cult. And they can be very dangerous. But are they seductive to people like you and me and anybody else? I would say absolutely. I'm sort of like, the Marx quote, I would never want to belong to a club that has me as a member. So I'm naturally suspicious of groups like that are love bombing. And I'm like, whoa. But some people really want that. They're lonely, or they're vulnerable, or they're in this certain place of their life where they're like, the world has stopped making sense. I want somebody to explain it to me simply, and I don't want to think anymore. It hurts. And they fall prey to this and end up more and more indoctrinated until they're, what you would call brainwashed. And so that's sort of what happens in The Children of Red Peak, where you see that the group these kids grew up in was actually, had its trade-offs and faults, but it was they considered it a beautiful childhood, and they felt warm and loved and safe and protected, and they had beliefs. And now, but then when they went to Red Peak under the influence of this possible entity, then it started to become a cult, and then you got to see how easily it could morph, and that's where it became what we would consider evil or cult. So, what about you? What attracted to you to? I know that climate change is a concern of yours, like you said, but was there anything else thematically that attracted you to apocalyptic fiction? And do you think this is something you'll write more of, or you'll move on to something else?
That's a great question. I think I actually was genuinely surprised that I ended up writing apocalyptic fiction and specifically zombie fiction. In my wildest dreams, I would not have predicted it. I was writing funny, humorous mysteries before, so it seemed like quite a big leap. I also don't feel like I'm incredibly well read in that genre, so I had some. Later on, I had some imposter syndrome about, and also the worry about bringing very disparate things together, when, certain people have an idea of what horror is and what, when there's those very distinctive genres. But ultimately, I think the draw is, first of all, as a writer, the apocalypse is such a sort of so open to innovation. It's this great big creative landscape for us to kind of have that opportunity to rewrite and reset, or and just go wild. But also zombie fiction in particular has sort of a history of being a form of social critique, an allegory for many things, whether it's race relations or terrorism or consumer culture, or pick your social quibble. It's really sort of an investigation oftentimes of our cultural climate, and so it was really an effective way for me to explore what would happen without people, and what this meant in an environmental way. What would happen to the environment if people were not around? So yeah, I think it was the allegory, and I wonder too, I think something about the ambulatory dead I relate to. I'm very tired lately. So I wake up in the morning very much like a zombie these days. But I feel like I'm writing a series, so I will continue. But I don't know if I would continue to write, I think I have explored, as much of, I don't think I would continue necessarily writing about zombies. And it's funny, I don't even feel like I'm almost reticent to call it a zombie book. I feel like really the focus is on the animals and giving a voice to the natural world. And the real impetus was something that I'm so grateful that's happened, which is that readers will sometimes message me and say, I'm looking at the world a little differently. I'm talking to my neighborhood crows, or I'm looking at the trees differently. And that's really what I set out to do. And I think that the zombie genre is really a beautiful vehicle for examining social change, I think.
Yeah, there is a pot of gold at the end of the writing rainbow, and it's that reader feedback. You get a letter like that. It's just like, it just fills your gas tank for a month. I mean, it's just amazing.
It does.
And congratulations.
And,
so whenever you enter a genre, I mean, I understand your feelings, but you did extremely well with it. The book has been very, very successful. So congratulations on that. And after writing your mysteries, did the success of the zombie book surprise you at all? And
yes, tremendously. Yeah. It actually came, I'd actually been going through a lot of rejection, like years and years and years. And I love to talk about it because I feel like that's not the story that gets told when you have a success. Yeah. It's suddenly the light is all about like, oh, look at this. The overnight success thing drives me crazy because I don't think there really is any of that, or there's very little. And if you have it, that's a burden unto itself, I would imagine. But I had been acting in LA for 10 years, and that was a complete failure. So I was already holding all that rejection. And then it was about 8 years-ish of writing rejection, short stories to places and never getting in. And, I wrote these humorous mysteries and was back and forth with an agent, got very close, but no cigar. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, I joke about it a lot. Like, it was a really hard time, this sort of last rejection of the novel that I'd written. It was so tough. This agent was so wonderful. I would have loved to have been represented by her. She was wonderful, but ultimately I over edited the novel, so it fizzled out. And I fell into this real funk. I joke about it now. I say I was like rolling on the floor and drinking wine out of a salad bowl, which was true. I really was. And it was my husband who said, why don't you go write the thing about the crows? And I love them, and I've spent time with them, and I'd had this, it took me a while to come to the idea that the crow would be talking about the end of humanity. But once I had that, I was off to the races. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it's a funny profession.
And then all the new doors open, and so that's fantastic. I love hearing stories like that. Yeah, congratulations.
Yeah, thank you.
People ask me how did you get where you are? And you go to a lot of writing conferences, and you ask that question of some people who are it's not like you make it or you don't. I always consider it a ladder, and everybody's on these different rungs, right? And so every time you go up a rung, you're like, oh, I got a lot more to go if I want to keep going. But so somebody lower on, and there's no value judgment to that. It's just we're all climbing the ladder. We're just there at different places at different times and so on. And so somebody at a different part of the ladder might say to me, well, how'd you get there? And a lot of people at writing cons will answer you this question. Well, just do what I did. And here's what I did, right? And so I consider, like, how would I tell you what I did? Well, I fell up the stairs. That's how I consider it. Like, how do you tell someone how you fell up the stairs? I mean, it's like a total accident. So for me, it's all about just keep writing, keep at it, you can't give up, and hopefully you and continue to come out with product, and hopefully you'll have that book that's at the right place at the right time. And so you did, and you got in that sweet spot, and then all sorts of doors open, and it's so much easier to hit that sweet spot. So congratulations true. Again. So you said you're looking at a series, so you think your next book won't be zombie per se, but you think you'll stay apocalyptic, or you think you'll stay animals?
I think I don't know for sure. I mean, I know there is a second book. There's a sequel that comes out next year. Okay. So that's still firmly in line.
Gotcha.
And then I'm playing with some things at the moment, but I don't know. It's hard to it's too soon to tell what it is. As usual, I've thrown myself in the deep end. But I love that. I love that metaphor of falling up the ladder, especially as someone who has literally fallen upstairs a few times. It's really nice to hear that from someone who is farther up the ladder than I am, and you have to also remember that it is this sort of very different experience for each writer, and we can share this information and really help each other, because it can be an isolating process.
But none of them is a formula. They're just different paths you can glean truths from and lessons from. But not that there's a right way, and if you're not doing it the right way, you're doing it wrong. Yeah, and that success is an absolute. I mean, like I said, there are many rungs of the ladder, and you just have to keep fighting to get further up. Yeah,
I love that little boost of hope.
Yeah, and take advantage of those opportunities. To use another analogy, it's sort of like pushing at a wall, and you push and push as hard as you can. You finally move it forward 3 feet, and you're like, I moved it forward 3 feet. That's great. But then you look side to side, and you've got a lot of space now to play in, and you can soon as you move that bar forward, you can for yourself. There's a lot of opportunities that come up, and then it becomes easier and easier to move the wall. So. Yeah. So should we take some questions from our fans?
Let's look at some questions.
You want to pick one first?
Sure. Let's see. Well, this one's at the top, so we'll go there.
Okay.
Are there any new emerging trends in horror that you're really excited about? That, I think, is your question, because I'm not as, well read in the horror genre. In fact, I just feel like I'm just catching up with horror in the daytime, like a baby.
Yeah, that kind of. I went through that too, and I went from zombie, where I read 1,000 zombie books, and then to a horror, where I read 1,000 horror books, and then I'm starting to get back to being eclectic. But yeah, I ended up getting my own crash course just a few years earlier. But yeah, I think there's some interesting trends in horror that I think horror is getting a little more literary, where we're seeing more experimentation. And so you're seeing authors like Paul Tremblay, get popular, and I would consider Paul to be, a little bit more have a little more of a literary spin on horror, and I think that's why he's so successful. And I think that's really promising, because when if I read a story about, a werewolf, I don't really want to read a story about a werewolf. I want to read a story about a person who is becoming a werewolf, and what does that mean? And so, Stephen Graham Jones did a great book called Mongrels, where he examined werewolves. So he did two things. One, I really loved the characters, so I cared about what was going on.
Yeah.
And the other thing was, he did this whole kind of different take on it. They're like sort of like redneck werewolves who live in trailer parks and stuff like that, because they live off the grid. They have to stay away, and they're like slaves to their desires, and they're constantly dealing with this. And it made it feel very lived in and gritty and real to me. So I kind of love that too. So I love different takes on. I don't mind familiar tropes. I love new tropes. But for me, it's all about, I say that back in the zombie days. Don't tell me a story about zombies with people. Tell me a story about people with zombies in it. Like they're part of the setting. They're an antagonist. They're an obstacle, whatever. But make me care about the people. So as long as I care about that. And in your case, it's animals, but they have sort of they're commenting on humanity, and they have traits I can relate to as a reader. And so I was invested in them. I was telling you before the call, I love ST, but I fell in love with Winnie the Poodle from the get-go. I just thought she was such a great character.
She's a real poodle. She's based on a poodle who lives in Berkeley, and is one of the funniest poodles. She's hysterical. She does this like hilarious dance whenever she gets her snacks, and she's the only dog I know who wouldn't thank you for meat. She likes vegetables. Yeah. And she's missing teeth, so there's nothing more delightful than watching her take down a carrot with just like gumming it it's so much fun. She's a delight.
Yeah, one of the great things, very clever, the way you did the introductions, they were not only relating to the human in their life, they were relating and behavior from the human we relate back to animals, but you related the animal to another animal in the house that they had disdain for. So like that animal is kind of, that dog is sort of like like I'm more like a person, right? And that dog just, so I kind of enjoyed that too. So those, I guess, so I don't know. I guess I didn't say a lot of trends in horror. But that's a note. I think I would consider that a notable trend. It's a little bit less about in popular horror, like what you'll find being favored by the big publishers. It's a little bit less about shock. It's a little bit less about horror, and a little bit more about people's human stories with horror elements. And frankly, the publishers are smart to jump on that, because you can tell a horror story where horror is a story's black beating heart, and that has a very core market, and there are products for that, books for that, and they are great, and that is awesome. Yeah. But there's also among publishers a keen eye to, well, maybe we want to tell a story with horror elements instead of a horror story with other elements. And so, because if I tell a literary story or another type of story with horror elements, I will have a bigger reader base and it'll be more popular.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of a trend we're seeing in horror as well. And I think part of what's driving the move more towards lit horror. Do you agree with that? And I guess if you had if you were to read horror, what would you be looking for in a horror novel? What would you like to see
Probably
the trends?
Probably exactly what you're talking about, more of a literary spin or more sort of cross genre elements. Because I like to be surprised that way. And, for a scaredy pants like me who can't, I'm specifically afraid of jump scares or, it's
I hate jump scares.
Oh, gosh, my husband has to make noise clanging pots around the house so I know where he is, because I once threw a conditioner bottle at him and tried to surprise me. And fortunately, he works in video games, so he's very good reflexes, and he did like a Matrix, and it sailed over his head. I don't know. I
watch a lot of movies like this.
Yeah,
because I'm ready for the jump scare because I'm squinting at it. I watched like half of the Hill House, the Netflix Hill House show that way.
Yes,
I was like,
yes,
this.
Oh, that's a good one. I actually watched that. Yeah, but I read. What did I read? I read. I weirdly, and this makes me feel like this makes me a little bit ashamed that I haven't read as much horror. Is that I was recommended. It was recommended that I try Stephen Gregory's The Cormorant. And I know that it was partly because there's a bird, and but it was a tailored recommendation, which is one of my favorite things when someone says to you, a bookseller or a book blogger says, "I think you need to read this book." I take it very seriously, so I got a hold of it and I read it at the beginning of the year, and that has become one of my all-time favorites. I was so haunted by that novel, and it's so beautifully written. And it's one of those things that stayed with me. So I don't know about trends, but I am certainly just because that was written a long time ago. But I'm going to continue my horror dabbling. I am. Yeah.
Yeah, I found.
Shall we dive in?
Let's do it.
Oh
no, go ahead. What I was going to say, I think, is asked to someone else and someone else's.
Oh really?
Yeah, okay. So I'll probably address someone else's.
Should I go
question.
for that second question there? Yes. What made each of you decide to tell your stories from the perspectives that you did? I think in both cases there was more obvious perspective. Craig before the mysterious thing happened at Red Peak, which appears only as a flashback, and Kira from the POV of a person rather than animals. But the way you chose to tell the stories that made them more distinctive. I'd love to hear about the process behind those decisions. What do you think?
You made a very strong choice with your perspective. I'd love to hear.
Yes.
You go first on this one if you'd like.
I feel like once I had, I was so keen to write about crows and I didn't know how. I didn't think anybody would be interested. I am that. We don't go to parties anymore, but back in the day when we would go to parties, I'm the one who would just like, well, did you know, the bird nerd that starts, and you can see the person with their glass of wine, like trying to figure out how to escape because I'm telling them about crow traits. So I was desperate to find a way to talk about it. But it wasn't really until my husband said, really, because you love them so much and you know so much about them and you have a good connection with them, that's a really great way into a project, is to just, Karen Joy Fowler, the wonderful writer, she has a list of running favorite things that she keeps, and when she teaches, sometimes she encourages other writers to keep this, and I would recommend it to writers and just people in general to keep a list of things that you love, because there's all sorts of treasures in there. And I when I did that, crows are right at the top, and it wasn't. I was driving when the idea came to me about the crow actually telling the story, which seemed so fascinating. It suddenly hit me. I was driving and it was like, well, what if the crow's telling the story? And what if he's telling our story? And what if he's telling the story about our extinction? Yeah. I'm embarrassed to say I raced home. I'm normally a pretty good, I mind the speed limit, but not that day. I was home and I started writing that first chapter from his perspective. And it just came out. And I think it was a combination of passion for crows, passion for humor writing. I've written a lot of satire for publications. All of those things just kind of culminated in a really great way, in a way that I was enjoying it. And I also let go of expectation. I did not expect this novel to be published. I thought it was way too weird. Yeah. So that's how I came to crows.
Well, that's awesome.
Or my crotagonist.
The crotagonist. The result speaks for itself. It's an incredibly charming book. I'm enjoying it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So for me, for Children of Red Peak, I kind of alluded to this earlier, but I wanted to tell the story of a new religious movement that lives on a commune. That this is a nice place. These kids are having a childhood there, and then it suddenly goes bad due to a corrupting influence in that environment, where that group becomes a cult with everything that means, and then it suffers a horrific end. I didn't want to tell that story just straight up. I wanted to show what the effects of it were, and like I said earlier, Kean Patrick Burke's Kin was sort of inspiring to me on that, like this whole idea that this horrific thing happens that you would see in a horror movie, but okay, what are the consequences of this? I love anything, any fiction, movies, anything that is, says to me as a grown up, hey, there are consequences to this, right? So I was a big Game of Thrones fans until season 8, but and because everything had consequences, and I just absolutely love that, and it was just excellent storytelling, right? And so for the Children of Red Peak, I wanted to tell the story on these two timelines. One, I wanted to show the years later, the reaction to the events of the past, how these people are coping, and then how are they going to resolve this once and for all? They have to go back. They have to physically confront what happened to them. They have to confront it in memory, and then they, instead of just shoving it away and suffering with it, and they have to go back and physically confront the place itself and making the fateful climb on that mountain again. And and then I wanted to also say, well, wait a minute. Well, what are they actually reacting to? Well, I wanted to deliver that and kind of reveal it in dribs and in drips. And so there's something good for a writer sometimes to keep secrets. You don't want to tell everything straight up. You want to kind of allude to that this is something horrible, and that these people in the present don't actually want to remember it. And so it starts to come out more and more. And as they realize they have to confront the past, the floodgates open and these memories start pouring out. And then we see what happens what happens at Red Peak to these people, and then leading up to the horrible last night. And so that was why I did the perspective as I did it. I wanted to tell the story of these children who are innocent, and they live on this commune, and they're having this religious upbringing, and to them it's wonderful. But then and they have this child's trust of their elders and this community there, and where they feel safe, and where their world's very small. And now years later, they're in the bigger world. They're trying to live their lives, and they're all kind of coping in their own way, by having character traits when they were children, kind of leaning on those traits that are helping them survive in the present, emotionally. And then to see them in the present, and to look on their childhood through now an adult lens, an educated lens, and then to go back and confront. It was just a series of perspectives that I thought really gave me a really well-rounded view, and allowed me to pluck at the horror instead of just punch the reader in the face and say, "Did you like that?" I could say, kind of pluck horror and kind of like, "Here you go, here you go, here you go," and have the reader be like, right? So horror is, and I think this answers a future question, and it was what I was going to say earlier, but I'll answer it now. There's horror. There's, and I don't know who originally did this, but I heard it from Stephen King, so I'm going to repeat him. There's horror, there's terror, and there's the gross out. So horror is like something unnatural is happening that gives us a feeling of horror. It's revulsion, right? So there's a lot. Horror is very popular. Then there's the gross out, where like their blood and guts are flying all over the place, and it's a gross out. There's a lot of horror. Kind of unfortunately leans on that sometimes, but it has its market, and I'm not going to judge. But then you have the terror, which Stephen King favors himself, and that's where the lights go out and you feel like a finger touch your neck, or or you go into a haunted house and you're like, this isn't scary, but you hear a child singing behind the wall. Ah, right?
Oh no, not the singing child.
I know. And nursery rhyme. Nursery rhyme.
No.
And yeah, so
dolls.
Yeah, that's terror. So I love terror. I want to make the reader feel something. So my novel, Children Red Peak, has a little bit of gross out, has some horror, but I try and lean on the terror where the reader does half the work. Anytime I can get the reader to meet me halfway, where I'm setting up a scene. I'm done. Now you're imagining it. I'm telling a horrific event. I'm done. Now you are filling in those blanks. And so if I can engage the reader like that, their brain stimulated, they're feeling the terror. And when the horror or a little bit of gross out arrives, they're like, "Wah!" It's all in context. It was all expected. They know it's happening. And it's a lot more powerful. At least I hope it is. I mean, that's the intent as an artist. But, YMMV,
Amazing.
Right? With readers.
Yeah, that's amazing. It's like a cake of doom. Putting all the elements in.
Yeah, you want to engage the reader on as many levels as you can. And the main thing is to give a sympathetic, not even necessarily sympathetic, but a protagonist they can empathize with. And so whether it's an animal or it's a human being, as long as the reader can connect. So, there's the whole neuroscience of writing where if you read a sentence, Jill kicked a ball. When you read that, you feel like your leg's kicking in your brain. Your motor cortex is actually firing. And so if you're using really active language and you're engaging the reader's imagination and you're delivering empathy, you're going to make the reader sweat. You're going to scare them. You're going to upset them. You're going to make them laugh and cry and sweat and all that stuff. And that's through the magic of fiction, which is really neuroscience. And the more you can engage through characterization, the better. Absolutely. So that's sort of my philosophy on it.
Yeah. Well said. No, that's absolutely. Okay. So we kind of answered that, didn't we? What does it mean for a book to be horror nowadays?
Yeah, I think that was the one.
That was the one.
So I skipped ahead.
This is a question for you. Where'd it go? There we go. If one has an interest in cults, do you have any good nonfiction books to recommend?
Nothing that comes to mind at the moment. I was more interested in, I did my basic research on how cults work. But I didn't want to duplicate a cult. I didn't want to create, here's this nice religious commune and they turn into that, nice and has its flaws, right? But it's basically overall nice as far as the characters are concerned growing up there. I didn't want it to say, oh, now it's the Manson family or now it's this. I wanted to take the principles of cults and sort of apply it to this group. So brainwashing, thought control, deprivation, to gain compliance, all those different things. So I was more interested in the psychology, and I was more interested in the psychology of how you can have this person who's, they seem all right, and then they're willing to do something absolutely horrific because of a belief system, and they believe that this is absolutely necessary and it's what God wants them to do. And so I was much more interested in the psychology of belief and how it informs action and behavior. And so I relied on a huge number of sources, a lot of Psychology Today articles, a lot of websites, a couple books just to see what the experiences were like. I think there was one called Cult Child about this horrific story about this girl who her mother goes through a horrible experience in her personal life, finds this belief system that gives her meaning and a new identity and drags her kids into it. And it's horrible for them from the get-go. And it's hard to read. I didn't finish it. Oh no. But I wanted to, I'm scared of real horror. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I like fictional horror because it allows me to confront horrible things without actually confronting horrible things. But real horrible things
That's right.
are very scary to me, 'cause as a dad and for my loved ones. Anyway, so I would, hard for me to recommend a single book that I was like, yeah, this is the book. If you're interested in cults, I would just sort of scour around. Like, don't worry about the cults. Like, if you're interested in cults, you can read about.
Oh my. I don't know if we've lost me or Craig.
Looks like Craig is frozen.
Oh,
Let's see if we can get him
Craig
back.
froze. Oh dear. It was very interesting. Well, I tell you what, I will have a look at a question. Okay, what are both of your favorite zombie stories that are not your own? It could be any medium: books, movies, TVs, etc. I think Craig is coming back. Is he coming back? I'm going to say I really love Shaun of the Dead. I love that. It's so funny. It's I love anything that Simon Pegg and Nick Frost do. They're so funny. And I think I'm by myself here. Am I lonesome?
Don't worry, I'm still here. I'm going to try to get Craig back. Go ahead and answer the question.
Yeah, Shaun of the Dead is my all-time favorite. And then I like Night of the Living Dead. I watched The Walking Dead, which was fascinating to me. I kind of trying to think of what else. I'm not sort of super well. I don't read a lot of zombie fiction, and I think that I really is just a case of not being very familiar with the horror genre and zombie stuff. I really liked Warm Bodies, and I meant to read the book, but I thought the movie was great. Loved the idea, kind of like what Craig was talking about. This idea of a zombie that actually has emotion still somehow and develops a crush. It's really great. Yeah. Okay, Craig, the update is that Craig is rebooting, and then he'll be back as reanimated Craig. Let me see if I can answer any more questions, and then he can answer. How do you plot out tension when you're outlining a new project? Or does the suspense, the ambient noises, and jump scares, does that bubble up to the surface while you're writing? Oh, that's a good question. I'm really interested to hear how Craig answers that. I know we generally talk about it as either you could be a plotter and you plot out your whole novel, or you're a pantser, which means you fly by the seat of your pants and hooray, you have returned.
My computer froze.
Reanimated
My computer was saying, stop talking.
Oh, yeah, you froze for a minute. It was
yeah, the whole thing
scary.
crashed.
I was scared again.
There you go.
So you were right in the middle of talking about recommendations for books, and not necessarily looking at cult books themselves, but
yeah, I was just going to say, if you want to learn about like a cult, like the Manson family, then you can, obviously there's lots of good books on that. If you want to learn about cults in general, one of the things that you can do is start with a question, and kind of research from there, and you'll find a lot of great articles, a lot of interesting sources. That's the path I ended up taking, because I wanted to know, like, well, what's in it for them? Why would you surrender your identity and all your wealth and everything for what, And I was genuinely curious, and I think if you enter this with a genuine curiosity, you'll find a lot of great sources that'll be very intriguing. because there's a really interesting psychology behind it, for sure.
Definitely. Very, very fascinating. I was just answering a question. I was fumbling through a question about when you actually I should read it again. How do you plot out tension when you're outlining a new project? Or does the suspense, the ambient noises, and jump scares bubble up to the surface while you're writing? And then I was just starting to talk about the fact that there's often, sort of sometimes a divide between how writers, navigate their own projects, whether you're what they call a plotter or a pantser, flying by the seat of your pants, or, you plot. I'm both. I do both. I plot to the best of my knowledge. I do a lot of research, plot, put in some major points, both on sort of a narrative level and an emotional level for the character. Mm-hmm. And then I fly by the seat of my pants and I type away and nothing goes the way I intended it to go. And, plot changes and this changes. And in terms of, sort of moments of tension, they're usually, I know from the plot point, I know that we're coming up to this, important plot point where something terrible is going to happen, or this person, somebody goes missing, something. So it's really about tailoring your writing to fit the level of suspense that's needed, what's called for in the writing.
Right.
And then, also a level of, so it's not as curated for me. I tend to sort of try to allow as much creative freedom as possible, and hope the muse is close by and smiling down.
But the more you write, the more the muse ends up visiting.
Yes.
Yeah, it's definitely a matter of practice. You train your brain. Yes. They did speaking of neuroscience, they did a study where they found that there are very few people who are naturally good at almost anything. It takes a lot of practice, and so that if you write keep writing, your brain actually tunes towards writing like an Olympic athlete's body tunes towards whatever sport they excel at, which I just thought that was fascinating.
I know, it's vindicating.
Yeah,
we are
practice makes perfect. Athletes. It really does, and it's comforting to start. Those writers who. Anybody here maybe wants to write a book and it never has, and they're worried they're no good at it. It's everybody's you start at somewhere, but you not nearly as good as you're going to be after practice. So you really don't know if you're a writer until you try and keep trying. But that trying is fueled by this desire. There's I have to write. I can't do anything else, so it's always been that way for me, and it's just part of who I am. So there has to be that drive and that desire, just like with Olympic athletes. Something's got to get you running a marathon every day to keep your body tuned for it. But the process I use is very similar to yours. I plot, and then major plot points. I started getting into a 4-act structure, using Larry Brooks's method and story engineering. Which breaks up the second act into 2 acts, which it kind of already is, but they don't call it that, but you should call it that. It helps. And then I started getting into character arcs, which is you have a character with a flaw who undergoes change and becomes a better or worse person by the end of the book, depending on whether it's a positive or negative character arc. And then in between all these points, I'll usually sit there with a pad and just take tons of notes, let beta waves going while I'm driving or in the shower or something, and research, lots of research. Like in my book, Suffer the Children, one of the characters works in waste disposal. So I learned everything about the trends in that and what it's like to be one of those, people on the trucks, and just to help it ring authentic and also fuel all that organic stuff. Like, there's a trend towards 2-person crews in the trucks to 1-person crews because they're automating it. What does that mean? That would give this person a lot of pressure, which I wanted them to be under. So it was like research can give you a lot of happy fuel for your writing.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is the so the character arcs. I rely a lot on John Truby, his book, which I think is sort of like the Bible of storytelling. And other than that, yeah, same as you. I kind of write in between these plot points and keep the character arc going. I know at a certain point of the book, my inner voice is going to say, you're working up to something big happening. It better happen.
Right.
If this is a suspenseful thriller type of story, you need more. Okay, now you need a lot more obstacles between the major plot points.
Yes.
And of course, this is a living document, and everything can change because your characters have a way of telling you, I ain't doing that. I'm going to do that. And that
Isn't that weird?
Yeah, they're like real. They become like real people. But I found that the character arc really helps me. I found that in my older fiction, I got to know them about a third of the way into it. And that's when I really knew the character inside and out and what they wanted and how they needed to change. And then I would keep going. And then I was like, oh, the first third doesn't work. Why? So I started to get more into the character arc straight up. And I do a lot less of that rewriting. It's more plot rather than who the character is. And so I find that kind of planning is absolutely essential. Not just so I know who the character is straight up, but that I'm much more efficient as a professional too, because I write a lot of these things during the year, and so I need to keep them coming out. So, and so to be able to write efficiently, I need to plan what the book is, what it is before I start it.
That makes sense. That makes perfect sense. And let's see. Okay, what was it like to write your first book? Did it require a huge leap of faith?
What about you?
Well, I mean, yes. Or maybe it required less of a leap of faith than less of a chokehold on goals. I think I had wanted to be published so much, and the longer I wrote and the harder I worked, the more I white knuckled this goal. I think you can really strangle the life out of something like that. You know, you can really sort of trip yourself up because it's too intense. And so what ends up happening is the writing starts to be tailored towards something maybe, or it's just so for me, Hollow Kingdom really happened when I completely let go and thought, okay, I'm not going to try to submit this. I'm just going to write this book because I found something really intriguing that I want to explore, and no one's going to touch this. You know, the character's name is short for 2 words I can't say that are expletives for fecal matter. I thought there's no way. But yeah, these things can happen. I think perseverance and being willing to be flexible, and as you said, keeping at it. Yeah. How about you? First book, big leap of faith?
Yeah, I think so. My first book, I had just graduated from college, and I was going to write this novel, and my decision was if this novel gets published, then I'll become a novelist. If it doesn't, then I'll go work for the man, and everything will be, and I'll just follow a career path. And so I worked on this novel for a year. I worked as a temp. I worked for a temp agency, so I was a word processor. And I was that guy I grew a beard, and I was like, I'm not going to cut my hair until my book's done. And I had a cardigan, and I didn't live in my mom's basement. I lived upstairs from my mom, and I rented a room from her. And I was this guy, and then the book, and actually surprisingly, the book almost had something. I wrote a book about original superheroes, and I was like, superhero fiction's going to be big. There's only like 2 books, and they were novelizations of the first Superman movie, and I think one was like a novelization of a Spider-Man thing. And I was like, this is going to be big, and it's not just going to be big on like licensed characters, because I had no idea Marvel was going to be big as it is with the movies. But I said it's going to get big with original superhero stories like Watchmen, that kind of thing back in the 80s. That translates to fiction so well. The idea of superhero as archetype, and what does this mean? And there's all these great philosophical stories you could tell. So I told this philosophical story, had lots of action, and it was an original superhero story. And it was, and it got me. So I had an agent interested. And then the agent was like, "Oh, you had a reader read it. You got to rewrite it." And so I rewrote the book purely for what the reader wanted. Then they had a second reader read it and hated it for all the things I changed from the first read.
No.
And yeah, and I was like, "Oh," and so it was a big fat no. And so I wasn't going to get anywhere with this. And so I kind of put it aside, and I shaved. I bought a suit, and I ended up working for an ad agency, and ended up writing every day. And actually kind of that career path kind of was really good for me, because I stopped treating like I'm going to write when the monkey is on my back and I'm struck by this muse, and it's like lightning, and then I'd be like that. I was that guy still, right? And then, I started to treat writing more like a craft, like here's how you tell a story. And I started to get interested in that kind of thing. And I was a little bit less about the inspiration and more about the doing, and just doing as a daily discipline. And writing the nonfiction for an industry ended up taking me into like a whole career of, I worked for a magazine in New York, and then Trade magazine. And then when I left that, I became a freelancer in that industry, just lighting industry. Like, what's interesting about that? Not that much. But it's interesting enough, when you're in it. And I just started every day. I write these articles, hundreds a year, all these publications for that industry, and it keeps me writing every day. I had to tell a story through nonfiction, and then my fiction sort of evolved with it. And then again, like you, just wrote something for the love of it. Like, I was kind of done with it. I was like, I'm sick of I'm sick of like agents who tell me I have to be published, and then publishers telling me I need an agent, and then writing to all these agents, and they send me back my essay, self-addressed stamped envelope with a form rejection without reading it, with a flyer telling me to buy their book on how to get published. So I was like, I can't take this anymore. So I ended up my daughter was born. I was like, you know what? I get a much better return on my nonfiction writing. I should just do that. But you know what? I have this crazy idea for a zombie book. And so I pitched a publisher, and I said, here's my zombie book. Here's a chapter. And he's like, great, send me the whole book. And I was like, I haven't written it. Like, I was like totally scheming now. I was like, I'm sick of writing books and everybody telling me I'm not going to read it. So I'm like, I'm just going to do a chapter then. And so there. And so I was like, oh my God. So I cranked this thing out, and then cranked it out again. And it actually ended up a half decent book, because I stopped sweating it. I just, like you, right? I was just like, I'm just going to do it.
Yeah.
And by writing out that crazy first draft and then rewriting it, it was such a faster process, and it was such a better book than I'd written before. And it wasn't overthought at all. It was a straight up zombie thriller. Army versus zombies. There really wasn't any books like that at the time. And this publisher absolutely loved it. And that's how I ended up on this track. Sorry, I'm talking too much. I see Ellen's like, we should probably wrap this up because it's 10 after. But how about we do one more and you answer, and I'm going to listen. I'm not going to say what.
I will very quickly add to what you said of like two things that I've now forgotten what one of them was. But the perseverance being so key, but also, those early novels, I talked about my debut, but there was a first novel. It was horrendous. It was like Clue set at Hearst Castle, and there was a rhino in it called Ernest, spelled wrong, which I thought was funny. It was just like this horrendous novel, but I feel like those early works don't get a lot of love, and they should. I feel like as a writer, every word you write counts. It's a step closer to the next thing. It's you flexing that writing muscle. I always think that's a good thing to share with people that because it's heartbreaking to lose those early novels.
Yes.
All right. How about this? For our last question. What's the next project you're working on, or the next thing you have coming out?
Easy for me. Children of Red Peaks coming out in November. So you go ahead.
November 17th. Yes. And you and I hope it's okay for me to give a little plug to indie bookstores. If you're, to support your local indie bookstores in this time would be a very good thing, because it's there are heroes, and it's a good place to buy it. I do. I have a sequel coming out next year. I'm very excited. It's next year seems far away, but it's coming. And then also the Hollow Kingdom's been adapted, or it's been optioned for a TV show with AMC. So hopefully
Very nice.
that will come to something. So yeah, that's what's next. And then tinkering and trying to remember how to write in the meantime. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, that's great. Well, if anybody, if we didn't get to any questions, or if anybody thinks of one and would like to contact us, you strike me as a very, very accessible person, Kira. So I'm sure you'd love to hear from people, and I love to hear.
Too.
That's something I would tell everybody. Like, everybody's like, oh, I don't want to bother my favorite writers. Bother us. We love to hear from you. It's the best thing ever. It's pure fuel. And it's so wonderful to engage, and it makes the novel a closed loop where we're now like kind of one entity, the reader and the writer, work symbiotic. So we love to hear from you. Absolutely.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And we will be celebrating the release on November 17th.
Oh, thank you so much. And yours next year. Congratulations to you on all your success. And it was really fantastic to get to know you and to do this event with you. Thanks a lot.
This was wonderful. Thank you. I feel very inspired. Yeah.
Right on. Thank you, everybody, for attending.